May 1945, Bavaria, southern Germany. The guns had gone silent. The Reich that was supposed to last 1,000 years had collapsed in 12, cities reduced to powder, roads choked with rubble, entire neighborhoods swallowed by the earth. General George S. Patton, the most feared armored commander in American history, was driving through a ruined Bavarian village in his Jeep, 4 stars on his helmet, ivory-handled pistols on his hips, a general accustomed to the geometry of war, flanks, advances, artillery lines. But what his driver slowed for that afternoon had nothing to do with strategy. There, barely visible in the shadows between 2 collapsed buildings, shapes, small ones, moving, flinching, watching. Children. Not playing, not crying, just watching, with eyes that had seen too much. Eyes that looked like those of old men, trapped in the faces of the very young. Patton's driver waited. The soldiers in the Jeep waited. They watched their general stare into the shadows at the gaunt, hollow-cheeked faces peering back. These were the Wolfskinder, the wolf children. And what Patton did next, and what he said, would quietly define one of the most complex moral moments of the entire Allied occupation. This is that story. And before we go any further, if this kind of history moves you, if you believe the stories that happen after the battles are just as important as the battles themselves, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on your notifications. Stories like this one deserve to be heard. Now let's get into it. To understand what Patton saw that day, you first have to understand the world that created the wolf children. Their story did not begin in Bavaria. It began more than 1,000 miles to the east, in East Prussia, that sliver of German territory on the Baltic coast, a land of pine forests and frozen rivers and ancient Prussian pride. By late 1944, the war had turned irrevocably against Germany. The Red Army was coming, and it was coming with everything it had. Millions of Soviet soldiers, burning with justified fury after years of Nazi occupation and atrocity, were pushing westward at a pace that defied belief. The Nazi authorities in East Prussia knew the Red Army was coming. They knew what it would mean for the civilian population. They forbade evacuation anyway. Gauleiter Erich Koch, the Nazi overseer of East Prussia, issued strict orders, strenges Fluchtverbot, flight strictly forbidden. Citizens who attempted to flee risked execution. The official line was that the German army would hold. The Eastern Front would not break. It broke. When the Soviets finally smashed through in January 1945, roughly 2.5 million people in East Prussia suddenly realized they were trapped. The evacuation that followed was not orderly. It was not managed. It was a human flood pouring westward through frozen countryside in temperatures that fell to -20 degrees. Horse-drawn wagons overturned on icy roads. Refugees were strafed by aircraft. Families were separated in the chaos of retreat. And the children, the smallest, the slowest, the most vulnerable, were lost. Some watched their mothers die from exhaustion in the snow and simply kept walking because there was nothing else to do. Others lost their parents in bombing raids and emerged from rubble to find themselves completely, utterly alone. Some were separated at train stations when overcrowded cars lurched away before families could reunite. Historians estimate that somewhere between 20,000 and 50,000 children were orphaned or separated from their families in the collapse of East Prussia and the mass expulsions that followed. 20,000, 50,000. Numbers so large they lose their human weight until you reduce them to a single face. A boy of 8, standing in a burned-out farmhouse, calling a name no one would ever answer. A girl of 6, carrying a sibling on her back through a forest she didn't recognize toward a village she'd only heard about. These children had no food, no money, no documents, no adults, no plan. They had only each other and the forests, and the desperate animal instinct to survive. And so they survived the only way they could, They moved like wolves in the shadows, in the darkness, in packs of 2 or 3 or sometimes 10, slipping through the edges of Soviet-occupied territory, sleeping in bombed-out barns, foraging for roots and frozen potatoes in abandoned fields, stealing bread when they could find it, begging when there was anyone left to beg from. One survivor, Ewald Gustav Bork, born in Königsberg in 1934, recalled it this way. In the winter of 1945, there was a great famine. We managed to survive for 2 years, but then we became terribly sick. My mother died lying right next to me in bed. I stayed on in the apartment for a few days after her body had been removed. I was desperate and didn't know what to do next. In the end, I decided to go to Lithuania. I had heard that there was food. He was 11 years old when he made that decision, alone. Another survivor, Bernhard Kusling, born in 1937, remembered, "My mother died in front of my eyes from starvation. My little sister cried inconsolably and lay next to our dead mother for days until she herself passed away. I was 8 years old and on my own." 8 years old, on his own. These children were called Wolfskinder, wolf children, by the Lithuanian farmers who sometimes encountered them creeping to farmhouse doors in the early morning hours, thin as shadows, asking in broken words for anything to eat. They were called wolf children because of the way they moved, like wolves, cautious, wary, silent, watching every adult for signs of threat before daring to approach. Many crossed the frozen Neman River into Lithuania, where farming families would sometimes take them in, give them new Lithuanian names, and set them to work in the fields in exchange for food and a corner to sleep in. Lithuanian families did this at enormous personal risk. Soviet authorities considered sheltering German children a punishable offense. But the Wolfskinder were not only in East Prussia and Lithuania. As the war ended, as the Reich collapsed territory by territory, the phenomenon of the wolf child spread westward, into the Rhineland, into Saxony, into the rubble fields of Berlin, into the alpine villages of Bavaria. Wherever the bombing had been heaviest, wherever the fighting had been most intense, wherever families had been obliterated and children had survived alone in the wreckage, there were the wolf children. Hidden in basements, sleeping under collapsed rooftops, eating whatever they could find in the ruins of a civilization that had eaten itself. This was the Germany Patton drove into in May 1945. General George S. Patton arrived in Bavaria as its military governor in the immediate aftermath of Germany's surrender on May 8, 1945. It was, by any measure, the wrong job for him. Patton was a warrior. He had led the Third Army on one of the most extraordinary armored campaigns in military history, racing across France, pivoting at Bastogne, knifing through Germany. By VE Day, his Third Army had liberated more than 80,000 square miles of territory and taken more prisoners than any comparable American force. He understood battle, he understood command, he understood the mathematics of war. What he was now asked to understand was something different, the mathematics of collapse. How do you govern a population of shattered, starving civilians? How do you administer a society whose government, infrastructure, economy, and moral framework had all disintegrated simultaneously? Official American policy on feeding the German civilian population was still being debated at the highest levels. Some argued the Germans had started the war, had supported Hitler, had enabled the Holocaust. Let them face the consequences. Others argued that collective punishment, starving children who had had no voice in Nazi policy, was both immoral and counterproductive. A starving population was a security threat. Desperate people caused chaos. The debate continued in Washington. Meanwhile, on the ground in Bavaria, generals had to make decisions now. Patton drove through his occupied territory and saw the human reality behind the policy debate. He saw the rubble. Bavaria had been one of the last regions to fall. American forces swept through in late April and early May, town by town. The fighting was swift. The occupation began immediately, but the civilian situation was severe. Food distribution networks had collapsed. Farms couldn't get produce to cities. Warehouses had been bombed. The trains didn't run on any consistent schedule. And everywhere in the ruins were the hungry, the sick, the orphaned, the lost. He drove through a small village. Accounts from soldiers of the Third Army place moments like this in multiple locations throughout Bavaria in May and June of 1945, and his driver slowed. Because there, in the shadow of a ruined building, something moved. They were in the gap between two collapsed walls, 3 of them, maybe 4. The ages were hard to tell. Malnutrition does strange things to the body. It makes children look simultaneously younger and older than they are, small in stature but ancient in the eyes. They were filthy, ash-gray. Their clothing was a collection of rags, clearly scavenged from abandoned homes, too big for their skeletal frames, held together by knots and desperation. One of them wore no shoes. Her feet were wrapped in cloth strips torn from something that might once have been a curtain. They had been living in the ruins, not passing through, living there. There were signs, a small cache of items in the corner, a makeshift shelter assembled from broken timber, the scattered remnants of whatever they'd managed to eat in recent days. Potato skins, the bones of something small. Wolf children, right here, in Bavaria. Miles from East Prussia, miles from Lithuania, but the same haunted eyes, the same feral stillness, the same instinctive assessment of threat and safety that living wild teaches faster than any school. When they saw the American uniform, when they saw the stars on Patton's helmet, they went rigid. Fear immediate, absolute. These children had been raised inside a propaganda machine that painted Americans as monsters. And now, a very large American general was stepping out of a vehicle and walking toward them, and every instinct they had developed over months of surviving in the ruins said, "Run." But they didn't run. They were too exhausted to run, too hungry to run. So they pressed back against the collapsed wall and watched him come. Patton stopped a few feet from them. He didn't speak immediately. He just looked at them. Looked at what the war had made of children who had committed no crime except being born German in a country whose leaders had committed every crime imaginable. Captain Thomas Sherman, his aide, stood behind him. He would later write about this moment in letters home. The description is striking. The general just stood there looking at them. I had never seen him look like that before. Not angry, not sad, something else. Like he was calculating something that had no military answer. What Patton was looking at, whether he framed it this way or not, was the bill. The final accounting of what total war does to the people who are never asked whether they want it. He turned to Sherman. "Do we have rations in the jeep?" "Yes, sir, K-rations." A pause. "Get them, all of them." Sherman hesitated. K-rations were field rations, American military issue. They were for soldiers, not for enemy civilians. There was no regulation that said you handed them to German children hiding in rubble. There was also no regulation that said you didn't. "All of them, sir." "All of them, Captain." Sherman walked back to the jeep. Patton did something then that none of the soldiers present expected from the general known as old blood and guts. He knelt down. He was 59 years old. His knees were not what they had once been. The cobblestones were uneven and cold. But he went down on one knee, bringing himself to the eye level of the children, removing himself from the towering, threatening posture of an armed authority figure, and placing himself, as much as a 4-star general can, in the posture of a human being talking to other human beings. The children stared. He held out his hand open, palm up. No weapon, no threat. Sherman returned with the K-ration boxes. Compact, olive drab, American military issue. each one containing enough nutrition to sustain a soldier for a day: biscuits, canned meat, instant coffee, cigarettes, chocolate, chewing gum. For children who had been surviving on potato skins and whatever they could steal from abandoned fields, it was an almost incomprehensible quantity of food. Patton held out the first box toward the nearest child, a boy, perhaps 7, perhaps 9. It was impossible to say with certainty. The boy looked at the box, looked at Patton's face, looked at the box again. He reached out and took it. Then the others. One by one, Patton or Sherman handed each child a K-ration. The children took them with the careful deliberateness of people who have learned not to trust abundance, who expect things to be taken back. But Patton wasn't finished. He looked around the space where the children had been sheltering. He saw, in the corner, a few items they had managed to scavenge, evidence of what their survival actually looked like stripped of any romanticism. There was almost nothing. What food they'd had was already gone. He stood, his knees cracked. He looked at Sherman. "Find out if there are more. In the other buildings, other children." "Sir." "You heard me, Captain." Because these 4 were not the only ones. This was Bavaria in May 1945. Wherever there were ruins, wherever there were collapsed buildings and abandoned cellars and bombed-out farmhouses, there were children. Not all of them wolf children in the East Prussian sense. Some were simply local children whose parents had died in the bombing, who had nowhere to go, no system left to take them in, no family remaining. They had all in their own way gone feral, gone wolf. Sherman began organizing soldiers to check the surrounding area. They found more. Not dozens, but more. Small clusters in basements. A boy alone under a collapsed floor. 2 sisters sleeping on a pile of old grain sacks in what had once been a merchant's storeroom. All of them with the same eyes, the same stillness, the same wariness. And Patton walked among them. One sergeant who was present, his name appears in various Third Army accounts as Haggerty, though the spelling varies, was not pleased. He had fought across France and Germany. He had seen what happened at the camps. He had watched his friends die on the road from Normandy to Bavaria. "Sir," he said quietly when Patton passed him, "these are German kids." Patton stopped. He looked at the sergeant. "They are children, Sergeant." "Yes, sir, German children." Patton's response was quiet, not angry, simply certain. "Children don't start wars. Old men do, remember that." He walked on. That evening, Captain Sherman wrote in his journal and in a letter home. The letter survives in family archives cited by several Third Army historians. In it, he described the scene in the ruins. He described Patton kneeling. He described the distribution of rations. He described the sergeant's protest and Patton's answer. And then he described the drive back. The general was quiet for a long time after we left. Then he said, almost to himself, "Not to me, not to anyone really, if we become like them, what exactly did we win?" It was not a speech. It was not a press conference statement. It was the kind of thing a man says when he is turning something over in his mind that has no clean resolution. What does victory mean? Not strategically, not militarily. Patton understood military victory completely. But what does it mean in human terms when you are standing in the ruins of the country you just defeated, looking at children who are hiding in holes because they have nowhere else to go? The easy answer is that they were the children of the enemy, and that collective guilt passes through generations. Germany had voted for Hitler. Germany had staffed the camps and manned the firing squads and shipped the cattle cars. Germany had done what Germany had done. But these children had done none of it. They had been born into it. They had been raised inside a machine of propaganda and war and had survived the machine's collapse in whatever way they could. They were not guilty of history. They were simply in it. Patton, for all his complexity, and he was deeply complex, deeply flawed in many ways, understood this intuitively. The Third Army, in the weeks following Germany's surrender, quietly established feeding stations for children throughout Bavaria. Not under specific orders from above, the orders were still being debated, but because individual commanders, following the example of their general, made individual decisions. Soldiers who had crossed France, who had bled at the Bulge, who had liberated concentration camps and wept at what they found inside. These same soldiers were ladling soup into the bowls of German children who flinched when they approached. It was not celebrated, it was not announced, it simply happened. Back in America, when word filtered through, the reaction was divided. Some were outraged. We're feeding the enemy while our boys are still coming home in boxes. The anger was understandable. The grief was real. But others, veterans' wives, pastors, nurses who had served overseas, understood something different. The children hadn't built the camps. The children hadn't ordered the bombing of London or the invasion of Poland. The children had simply survived a catastrophe created by adults and were now paying the continuing price of it in hunger and cold and fear. The Wolfskinder did not disappear when the war ended. That is one of the great hidden truths of the post-war period. For children in the Soviet-occupied East, the ordeal continued for years. The Wolf children of East Prussia who had crossed into Lithuania found themselves in a new trap. Lithuanian identity was being suppressed under Soviet rule. German identity was dangerous. And the children who had adopted Lithuanian names and Lithuanian lives to survive couldn't reclaim who they were even when they wanted to. Many grew up unable to speak German, unable to return to Germany, unable to prove their origins. Some didn't know their own real names. The Iron Curtain descended and sealed them in. It was not until the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991 that many of them could begin to speak, could begin to tell what had happened, could begin the agonizing process of finding out whether anyone in Germany remembered them, whether any family had survived, whether any records existed of who they had once been. In the late 1980s, several hundred survivors formed the association Edelweiss Wolfskinder, the Edelweiss Wolf Children, and began petitioning the German government for recognition, for citizenship, for some acknowledgement that they existed and that what had happened to them was real and mattered. By 2008, roughly 93 known Wolf children still lived in Lithuania, all of them in retirement age, many of them unable to read or write, the schools they never attended, the educations they never received, the childhoods eaten alive by survival. They got a small additional pension from Lithuanian law in 2008, around €50 a month, for years of forests, frozen rivers, abandoned identities and silence. Gisela, who had escaped a Soviet death march at age 14, lived in Lithuania for decades. When a documentary filmmaker found her in her old age, she described what she remembered of 1945 in one simple sentence that contained everything. It stays with you like a scar. In 2013, a German drama film called Wolfskinder, directed by Rick Osterman, told the story of a boy searching for his brother through the ruins of 1946, moving through the forests of Lithuania and the back roads of a broken world. It brought the story to a new generation of German audiences who had largely never heard of these children. A memorial was erected 5 kilometers north of Tilsit, now Sovsk, in Russia, at the crossroads where many Wolf children once passed. Its inscription calls for the world to remember all human beings who were killed or died from starvation in East Prussia in the years 1944 to 1947. The orphan children who were left behind. Their story had been suppressed for decades, deliberately, uncomfortably, necessarily, some argued, in post-war West Germany. Speaking in detail about German suffering in the aftermath of the war was considered a form of false equivalence. The Holocaust was incomparable. The crimes of the Nazi state were incomparable. To emphasize German civilian suffering risked minimizing all of that, or worse, being weaponized by far-right revisionists who wanted to use the wolf children as proof that Germans, too, were victims. The argument was understandable. The result was that tens of thousands of real children, real human beings who had really suffered and really survived, were erased from the public historical record for nearly half a century. They were remembered only in the shadows, only in the whispers of old people in Lithuanian villages who still carried the scars. Patton was relieved of his command of Bavaria in October 1945, after a series of controversial statements about denazification policy and the Soviet Union. His complexities were real and documented. He was not a simple man to admire without reservation. But something in him, on that day in the ruins, functioned the way the best of us hope we would function when tested. He saw children. Not German children, not enemy children, not the children of people who had started a war and murdered millions, not a political problem to be solved or a humanitarian dilemma to be referred up the chain of command. He saw children hiding in holes in the ground, afraid of him, thin as winter branches, with eyes that had already seen too much of the world's worst capacity. And he got off the jeep, walked toward them, got down on one knee and gave them food. The soldiers who were there remembered it long after they had forgotten the names of the towns they'd liberated and the bridges they'd crossed and the medals they'd received, because it was the kind of moment that doesn't announce itself as significant. It simply happens, and then it stays. The wolf children's story is not comfortable history. It sits in that difficult space between guilt and innocence, between justified anger and impossible compassion, between the crimes of a nation and the fate of the children that nation left behind. The question Patton asked himself in that jeep, if we become like them, what did we win, is not a question with a tidy answer. It asks us to think about what victory costs, what it costs to remain humane in the aftermath of catastrophe, what it costs to extend care to people you were just told were your enemies, what it means to separate a crime from a child. The wolfskinder who survived grew old in the forests and farms of Lithuania, in the bombed streets of German cities, in the quiet spaces of lives that carried invisible weight. Most of them never fully told their stories. The trauma went too deep, the silence lasted too long. But some did, and their accounts, gathered by photographers, historians, documentary filmmakers, the German Red Cross, form a record of what it looks like when war consumes not just the people who fight it, but everyone it touches, every child in every ruin. Gisela, who survived a Soviet death march at 14 and lived her whole life on Lithuanian soil, was asked near the end of her life what she wanted people to know about the wolf children. She thought about it for a long time. Then she said, just that we were there, just that it happened, just that we were children. That's enough, that's everything. They were children. And in the ruins of Bavaria on a day in May 1945, a 4-star American general understood that, got down on one knee, and fed them. If this story reached you, if the image of those children in the ruins, of Patton on one knee on the cobblestones, of Gisela carrying a scar through 80 years of silence, if any of that moved you, then do something simple. Hit the like button. It takes 1 second and it tells this platform that stories like this one deserve to be seen by more people. Subscribe to this channel, because this is what we do here. We don't just tell the war stories. We tell the stories that happen when the war ends and everyone goes home, and the people left in the ruins are still trying to figure out how to survive. Turn on notifications so you never miss a story, because history isn't finished with us yet, and the stories that get forgotten are the ones that hurt us most. We tell these stories so we don't have to live them again. Leave a comment below. What would you have done driving through those ruins, seeing those children in the shadows? There's no wrong answer, just the question. See you in the next one.